I've always been a bit disorganised when it comes to my sketchbooks. I try very hard to remember where I'm working on any given subject, but inevitably I end up with drawings and notes and sketches and doodles and scribblings of thoughts all over the place in different old sketchbooks and notebooks and scraps of paper, whatever's to hand at the time when I'm thinking. However, when it comes to getting down to a coherent body of work, then it can be less than helpful. This sketchbook and this body of work I'm presently working on is called Breath. And it all began just over a year ago in November 2019 when I went on a self-directed residency to Carlaverick Wildfowl and Westlands Trust on the Solway Firth. That's quite near to where I live and only a couple of miles from where I was born. Of course, it was winter and the barnacle geese were already overwintering there, and they very quickly became the focus for me, which is, although I knew about them, I hadn't expected them to have quite the effect that they had. I thought I was there more to look at the land of the Merse and the big Solway sky, the sky of my babyhood. That was true, of course, but I had underestimated the draw of the beguiling barnacle geese. So that's how I began. Mesmerised by their monochrome shapes, the geese sitting in the fields feeding, black, silvery grey and white. I was struck by how when they first took flight, they were tumbling about, a bit like crows do, until they gradually came together and assumed their familiar arrow formation. So these were just quick sketches done to capture that. It was really all about the texture of their striped plumage flashing in the air. And for some of the days I was down there, it was particularly bright, but with that kind of light that you get from reflected water and from the whole countryside down there being rained on during the night. So everything was quite luminous and gave a particularly magical light. I was really wanting to capture something of the texture of the birds as they flew in unison. So these flows and ribboned lines became really important. And then, as I did more and more work in the evenings when I wasn't out walking, I found myself over and over again marking stripes of plumage, which is so distinctive on the barnacle geese. This is worked with soluble graphite pencils like these, which I dip in water or wet the paper and then mark on them. And it gives really beautiful, thick textured lines, or as well as very fine ones. But you can really work into the paper with it and create the kind of texture that you want. So this, I make no apologies, this sketchbook is filled with images like this. The lines moving and bending and blurring as the birds flew. I particularly love the smudging effects you can get with soluble graphite when it's still wet, so you can rub over it with your fingers or with a brush. You can also get really good sort of globby texture with it, so it's actually quite sticky to work with, which is that lifting off the paper creates a different texture, which I really am drawn to. But that then mixing with a very finely drawn, this is a grey ink pen, very fine writing pen which I use, which just contrasts with the heavier graphite, but creates a sort of a lightness that I really like. Again, I've done a lot of pieces with the sheets of of paper in the sketchbook and then torn up and then mixed with the graphite pencils and the grey ink pens over and over again. This one I've used tissue paper to exaggerate the texture. You probably won't be able to see it, but there are lines where the tissue has sort of bunched together and it gives an extra feel. And that's a technique I use quite often when I start painting with oil paints, to get the texture, as well as using the tissue paper on the surface and then pulling it away. I can also embed it into the oil paint on the surface of the panel. Here, bringing in a bit of watercolour, just to see how that worked. Back again to the tissue paper. More and more texture here. This time using some ink, as well as the graphite. The ink can be quite smudgy on the tissue paper, which is what happened here when I started doing monoprints of the tissue paper on top of ink and paint and graphite, which created these effects. This one I was mindful of the idea of the imprint of breath on the sky, the effect that breath has in our atmosphere. On this one I'm using a graphite tablet, but it's a white tablet over the grey, which again accentuates the texture I'm using on a slightly heavier paper. When we come to these pages, this is where I'm using a very heavyweight watercolour paper and marking into it. I'm wetting the paper and then marking it in on top with graphite again, and then scratching into the surface using a scalpel, which I use all the time for marking, which can create scratches in the surface like this, where you can actually wear away the paper as the geese breathe. That's my thinkings there. And again here, elongating the shapes out, which is then going to be translated into a painting. Back again, revisiting the plumage marks, I suppose, if you like, and the lines of the flow of air, the flow of birds, the flow of the land too. When I work in watercolour and graphite, I like to work on top of the watercolour with the soluble graphite, and then that can allow me to get quite a misty effect from the lines, quite soft, but which will contrast where the line drops onto the dry paper. And we're really getting to the point now where I can take this and make it into a painting, and it's really kind of coming together, the lines, the form, and the thinking as well, which is really important. I'm finding a theme which I can work with and develop. And here I've written, we're connected, the same sky, the same air, the same breath. And that's pretty much the construct around breath that I'm working with at the moment, and I continue to work. I can see it going on for quite a long time. So you get the idea, and then you start playing with that. How can I develop it? I'm using watercolour. So how does that work? Maybe not, but it's there to remember, to think about. Here, using Indian ink with a split bamboo pen to create strong lines, and I particularly like the split bamboo because it can be really scratchy. Here's one I use here, and you can see it's all broken, but when you put that into the ink and then onto the paper, it sort of scratches and stutters and blotches, and that's exactly what I want. Again with the ink and the bamboo, the notion of the way we breathe, in and out, a flow, a smudge, a billow. With the Indian ink, I found that I could make a much looser interpretation of the lines that I wanted and incorporate it into a whole notion of waves of breath, the flapping of wings, the beating downward. So it becomes a bit looser, and this can translate quite well into oil paint and the way I work with the cold wax. I love the bleeding of the ink into the paper, which you can extend by using the pen ink dry as well as full of ink. So you're getting shadows and echoes all the time. More of the same, creating the flow. Scratching as you go to create these sort of lines which are fading out. Now at this point I feel like I'm starting to get to where I want to be. It's been pared quite far down, a couple of lines of watercolour on paper, and then graphite pencil and ink on top. It feels like I'm getting to where I want to be. Again, trying it out here with more watercolour. And again. So this is very simply done, a bit of watercolour onto the paper and then working into it quite loosely with graphite pencil. I think every now and again when I'm working, I feel that I'm getting too complicated and too bogged down in a certain thing, and I try and loosen up every now and again by just working across the pages like this. But what I wanted was just that sense of a constant connection, of a continuity, whether it's the birds in flights or the flow of air, the wind, the movement of the water across the land. It was something that I wanted to feel. And then back again. Interestingly here, I'm paring it back again, but this time I'm using a different form of graphite. This is a graphite putty. Now it comes like this, as quite a soft, workable, malleable putty, and it's sort of what's the word? Suffused, imbued, saturated with graphite. In any case, it feels quite damp and sticky, and it makes your hands beautifully black and messy, which I quite like. But it's then another way of marking. So this is just marking with the putty straight onto the paper. What you get are the beautiful textures of the paper, like a rubbing over it, and then that can be accentuated with pen marks and pencil, as I've done here. More bird trails. Now these pieces are quite important, and as a way of explaining how I work in terms of the concept of my work. Here I'm thinking about the sky cover and the birds in the sky, and then the feel of their wings as they're flying. What does the air feel like below the bird's wing as it beats? So I've got a sort of downdraft, a downdrop of texture coming from the lines, and it's trying to piece together that physical observation of movement and trying to bring that into a different place in my head. So it's a conceptual understanding of movement, but also making that an emotional connection. And that's what I'm trying to put into my paintings, into my work. I want to be able to capture what that feels like, what it means So I should say I can spend a lot of time just looking at images like this, trying to capture those feelings. In a more agitated way, that's very loose drawing with the graphite. Back to the putty again. The texture of the putty is very variable, so you get a variable pattern mark on your paper, especially obviously if you're changing the pressure with how when you apply it. I find it's great for working into with pencil to accentuate some of the shadows. Drawing into the shading to give you a different feel of movement. And sometimes I work on great big pieces just as a mark making exercise. And then it's quite fun to cut them up to see how they work as smaller pieces. So, and that's mainly what these are. And then when I look at them like this, I can see another way to go. I've got the very heavy graphite here, with the smudged out and worked into lighter areas. But this all helps me build up the textures in my paintings, which are made up of many layers. So I find that that's a good way of doing that. You can elongate and see how pieces work together. So it can be within one painting. You've got the working of forms and tone together, or they can be a series of paintings. And that's what I find I get from these sort of pieces. Just recently I found a quote from James Joyce, and he wrote about, what he said was, in the particular is contained the universal. And I realised when I read it, that's what I'm trying to do. It's the way I put texture and shapes and light and negative space together. That's what I'm trying to do. It's trying to contain the very essence of something in a physical way which you wouldn't normally expect, but it says something about something much bigger. And again, these folded out pieces. If you can separate out some beautiful areas of texture, some bleed marks, pressings where I've pressed paper on top of it, it really works, that heavy texture of graphite. It draws me in and helps me think what I'm going to do. This, I think, is a good wee example of the James Joyce quote. I love the idea of smallness representing something much bigger and meaningful. And that's what I've done with all these pieces here. So it's about texture, it's about line, it's about smudging. I think that the beauty of working this way is when you're working on a big piece and you're working fairly randomly, you're not always sure that you've got anything that works as a whole. But when you can look into it and break it down, and I could take the tiniest little piece of that and find that that would work on its own, like these pieces have. Or at least work as an idea which I can take forward. The small mark of in and out, here being breath. Here I've used watercolour blocks directly onto the wet paper, so you can get a good broad texture, but again it's quite textured, and some areas of smooth, some where it's much more bumpy. The water flows the pigment away, but then it's marking on top of it. There's a line here which I really like, and all that is a scratch mark made with the blunt end of the brush to create that sort of ripple. And again here, I could go on like this for ages. And these were just to remind me of the different quality of wet on wet markings that I could achieve using brushes, but directly applying the watercolour ink onto the paper and then marking into it. The same here. So sort of moving back again here, it's about the rhythm of marks that I make. There's quite a variable texture, and if you looked quite close up, you would see within each line there's little lines where there's been pressure put on the paper, or where the water's bled the pigment away. Now you can't always get that effect. I'm not thinking necessarily about translating from one medium to another exactly, but it gives me an idea of where I want to go and what I might be thinking about in terms of the line and form and light that I'm using in a painting. Again, breaking it up into different shapes. The thinnest can sometimes be the most interesting. More particular marks. Now this is pretty much the end of this sketchbook for now, but I will continue to fill it. But I hope it gives you an idea of how I work and the connection with my bigger paintings.